Welcome to the broadcast, everybody. Today's broadcast is going to be focused solely on the last few days of the late Queen's life, as revealed to us in his version of events by Robert Hardman in his forthcoming book, Charles III, New King, New Court, The Inside Story. And an extract, or several extracts of this, have been put together and published in the national press as of yesterday. So for a bit of a change, I'm going to be focusing solely on the revelations contained therein, and it's going to be in the style of a story time, if you will, a Jackanory. So you've got to be in the mood for it. I'd suggest you pour yourself a nice cup of tea or coffee and cozy down with me, and I'm not going to be accompanying the broadcast with any visuals or anything particularly special for you to look at other than me. But if you're sick of looking at me, you can just look away and listen instead and soak it up that way. But there are quite a few little tidbits that might be of interest to you that are being told to us by Robert Hardman, who has form as a BBC commentator. He's commentated over a lot of royal events. He's a well-known, well-established journalist, a very close friend of the former Prime Minister David Cameron, for example. And so I'm rather intrigued to see what's coming out in this book next week. And I'm going to piece together what we know from what he has written in these extracts and from various other sources, including Spare, actually. So if you have your teas at the ready, my dear, then we shall begin. After the resignation of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the government was in disarray, the nation was in disarray. It's still in disarray. Seems to have been that way for a very long time, but particularly so with lots of the nonsense that was going on with the government at the time, prime ministers coming and going. Anyway, the late Queen, who I shall refer to as the Queen, had planned to travel from Balmoral down to London by royal train to preside over the transfer of power from Johnson to Liz Truss. The Queen and her doctors had a change of heart towards the end of August, and the Queen began to ask if she might remain in Scotland instead, because of her failing health and because she was comfortable in that oasis at Balmoral. And her private secretary, Sir Edward Young, spoke with the royal medical household and the cabinet secretary at the time, Simon Case, who also has a long-running association with Prince William, doesn't he? And it was Simon Case who consulted the Prime Minister. And you might recall that Anne said only recently in a documentary, she said, "I think there was a moment when the Queen felt that it would be more difficult if she died at Balmoral. I think we did try to persuade her that that shouldn't be part of the decision-making process," which is quite poignant, isn't it? Basically, she felt that she knew she was going to die, and she was a bit worried about how difficult it would be to spring Operation Unicorn into life as well as Operation London Bridge. But that was our late Queen, wasn't it? Anyway, the agreement was that politicians would in the end travel to Scotland instead of the Queen travelled to London. And so an hour at lunchtime was set aside for this, receiving Boris's resignation formally and greeting the new Prime Minister. She was determined to stand, despite spending most of her time in bed and in a chair. She was determined to stand for the function and be as gracious and neutral and respectful as she possibly could, and as she always was. And she only spent about 15 minutes with Mr. Johnson. He had had his time and all those weekly meetings. And he said after the fact that it was amazing how bright and focused she was, considering she was just a few days from death. This took place on September the 6th, by the way. She died, as you know, on the 8th. Well, next up was Liz Truss in her new tenureship, the short-lived tenureship of that Prime Minister. And Liz Truss told us that she stood up to greet me. She was clearly not very well. but we talked for about 20 minutes. She was alert. I would say she was relieved that the thing had actually happened and that we were now moving things forward. And also the Queen was looking forward to watching the racing because her filly by the name of Love Affair, what a wonderful name for a horse, Love Affair, was running in the 305 at Goodwood. Operation London Bridge was one of the very first briefings that was received by Liz Truss once she was installed as Prime Minister, because the late Queen's health was a matter of grave concern throughout government at the time. Everybody was conscious of what might be coming. And by the way, Love Affair triumphed, yes. So the late Queen's spirits were gay that day because her horse had come in, and that always put that wide smile on her face, didn't it, my dears? She was actually described by insiders as buzzy that evening. She had a gay, buzzy air about her, rather like her late mother used to have, with a tipple, because this was at pre-dinner drinks, and she was rather chatty, we are told, about the prime ministers that she'd dealt with throughout her life. But then she said that she would be retreating to her chambers to dine alone. And that was the final time that the wider household set their eyes on the late Queen. And then we come to the events of September the 7th. And this is when Elizabeth's health took a nosedive. And by happenstance, the Princess Royal was in residence. The Queen's daughter was there for her engagements throughout Scotland. This was just by chance, but it was perfect. Because Anne became a great host of that moment in history, you see. Anne also said in one of her recent interviews that it was pure serendipity that I was there. I'd been 2 days up on the west coast and I was coming back, stayed the night and was going south. And also Peter Phillips was with her, we learn. Peter was their eldest grandchild of the late Queen. He had been due to host a shooting party with lots of his mates, but that had been cancelled at the last minute. Also in attendance was one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, Susan Rhodes. Lieutenant Colonel Tom White was also there, the Queen's equerry. And the other one was our dear old Agent High Heels. Yes, Angela Kelly, of course, who the Queen had lent on so very much since the late Duke's death, even more so than usual. We know that Angela Kelly does not go down with everybody. Some find her abrasive, some find her a little bit cocksure and overbearing. The Queen loved her. The Queen adored her. And if she had had any inkling that that wasn't the case, then she wouldn't have put up with her for so many years, would she? She loved her. In a similar way, you could say, people aren't exactly magnetised to Prince Andrew. They don't especially find him charming. The Queen adored the boy. Adored the boy. But then it is said that the Queen was a true Christian who saw things through a Christian eyes and picked out the good in every person. Even Harry. It's a lesson for us all. The Queen announced that she was going to take to bed for the day, and this was highly unusual. Not one to slip into a onesie and settle herself down with a cup of tea and a box of chocolate digested biscuits and hobnobs. Not our late Queen. But she did take to bed, and the local GP, Dr. Douglas Glass, was summoned. Dear old Dr. Dougie. But she still planned to appear via video link at a Privy Council meeting in the evening. Isn't that extraordinary? She still planned, this is the day before she died, to take part in that Zoom, and they say possibly even from her bedroom. She would have done it from the royal bedroom. You know, they would have trussed it up so you wouldn't recognise that fact. But, you know, she was so frail but so determined that might have taken place. However, with minutes to go, the Privy Council were informed that the Queen would be cancelling on medical advice. And Penny Mordaunt, who you might remember carried the ceremonial sword at the coronation, she rather stole the show in some ways with that celebrated cameo, where she looked so wonderful and strong, full of fortitude and a little bit of sass and sexiness. Well, she was the newly appointed Lord President of the Privy Council at that time, and she was preparing to lead members of the council into the room when that news was received, with just 1 or 2 minutes to go. And she said, Penny Mordaunt said, "For me, that was testament to the depths of the Queen's devotion to her duty and to us. The day before she died, she was still trying to fulfil her obligations as sovereign, which I find incredible." Prince Charles, as he was, and the Princess Royal were communicating together at this time. Charles was at the other end of Scotland, Dumfries House in Ayrshire, and he'd been receiving regular updates, and Anne said, actually, that it was Charles that knew more about the late Queen's health than anybody else. He knew more about the state of their mother's health than even Anne, who was so close to her. Camilla, who was Duchess of Cornwall at this time, had been in Cornwall itself, filming Antiques Roadshow, as it happens. Do you remember that episode? She'd been filming that, but her flight back to Glasgow had been delayed, and she was trying to return. And she was trying to return because the daughter of George W. Bush, Jenna Bush Hager, had arrived at Dumfries to interview Camilla. She had arrived with a film crew from NBC, and that was what was scheduled to take place. It was going to be an interview about Camilla's book club and her reading, and it was due to take place the following day, on the 8th. Well, at this point there was no knowledge that the situation was going to escalate and escalate so rapidly. Charles faced a dilemma: business as usual or race to be at Balmoral. If he raced to be at Balmoral, the government and the media would get wind of it, and there would be all kinds of hullabaloo surrounding the peace of Balmoral, which Charles was eager to protect, that sanctuary. And we are told that there had been a similar downturn towards the end of 2021, so quite a few months previously, a similar downturn where everyone thought the end is nigh, rather suddenly, and then there was a sudden recovery, you see. And if you've got elderly, frail relatives, you will understand that. Such as my dear great aunt, that I tell you about quite often, who is... Her dementia, by the way, worsens by the week. It was a rather interesting Christmas, getting her out and about, but she did. And she sprinkled her sparkle over proceedings, as she always does. I love her so very much. But she does get more away with the fairies each week, to put it mildly. I hope you don't mind me interjecting to bring you up to date, my regular fruits. But as you know, she lived in a wing at my parents' house, if you will, and then just before Christmas, say November time, she was put into a care home because she got so terribly reliant on my mother, who has had her there for 5 years and is her constant companion. And my mother has a busy life of her own, and she's always been very social, but she was being relied upon more and more and more, and Auntie was finding herself in more and more precarious, dangerous situations, and we decided to put her in a home. She went in for a 2-week trial period. Well, within 5 days, Mother had taken her out again, and she's back home. She went through such stresses and strains. It was very emotional for her. It's taken its toll on my mother very much. Whether she's there or whether she's in a home, she's always on my mum's mind. So she is back, and she has good days and she has bad days. I'm just grateful that she still knows who I am, and she kind of knows who everybody is. She doesn't remember us from our past, though, and growing up, those kind of memories. Randomly she'll come out with memories from long into the distant past. You know, when she was growing up, a little girl, but she doesn't really remember. very precious memories anymore, this kind of thing. But I'm just putting that in the mix to say that if you've got elderly, frail relatives, whether they've got dementia or not, you know that there comes a time when you clutch your pearls and think that it's going to happen, and it doesn't, and it's going to happen and it doesn't. My great auntie, she actually took a tumble about 5 years ago. We'd been outside, she remained outside, and there was a sort of patio ground, if you will, hard stone ground outside, and mother called me, and auntie had fallen and cracked her head wide open, very, very bad. She must have fell on it directly. We think that this is what caused the dementia down the line a few years later, you see. And I thought she was going to go then, because we took her into hospital. I accompanied her in the ambulance. We took her in, and she was shaking and shuddering and looked as if she was absolutely about to go. Well, she got through it. She doesn't even remember it happening now. But it was very touch and go, and there's been all kinds of falls and things since then. So this is what happens. You wouldn't know from looking at her, though. She looks astonishingly youthful, and she's still one of the best dressed, best styled people that I've ever met. As evening fell, Anne and Sir Clive advised Prince Charles to be on standby, and apparently both of them urged him, think how you would feel if you never said goodbye. This was in order to encourage him back. And this was according to a member of staff, we're told. Well, I'm going to take that segment with a bit of a pinch of salt, actually, as it happens. I might be wrong, but I can't imagine that sort of schmaltzy phrase would be delivered to Charles. Maybe I'm viewing it from the wrong angle, but my reckoning is that Charles would be only too keenly aware of that himself without any advice or encouragement. That's my take on it. And now we turn to the events of September the 8th. Anne called and told Charles to come at once. Well, as it happened, a helicopter was on standby at Dumfries House to take Camilla to her engagements all over Scotland that day, and then return for the interview that had been scheduled. And in a trice, the pilot was given a new instruction. Just before 9:30 in the morning, the Duke and Duchess of Rothesay, as they were, took a helicopter, together with Sir Clive and with Camilla's private secretary and with the protection officer, for this 1-hour flight, the race to Balmoral. Charles read through briefing papers on the way, describing the initial phases of Operation London Bridge, to familiarise himself with them yet again. And Sir Clive was overheard telling staff members that he was hoping that it would be a wasted trip, another false alarm. The Queen's equerry informed Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, that the Queen had had a bad night, and that Charles was making his journey to Balmoral in haste. And not long after this, Charles himself called both of his sons, and Andrew and Edward, the brothers too, urging them to do the same. The Rothesays touched down at 10:30 in the morning at Birk Hall, their residence on the Balmoral estate, and they borrowed a dusty old Land Rover from a member of staff and drove to Balmoral. There they were greeted by Anne, who seems to have spent a lot of time at the grand entrance greeting people. They were escorted to the Queen's chambers, and they spent an hour by her side. Dr. Glass made it very clear at this point to the Rothesays how grave the situation now was. This was no false alarm. Well, Prince Charles must have known by instinct anyway, having summoned his family and knowing the chaos that this would cause to their schedules, their schedule of engagement, their itineraries, chaos. However, the Queen was still stable, and the feeling was that she actually had days rather than hours. Now, this is a recurring theme that we hear from Robert Harton, that at this point and for some considerable time after, it was still thought that she had days to go. This wasn't as if she was going to ebb away imminently. And For me, this explains why Charles and Camilla only stayed an hour rather than holding on for the final moment. Because reading it without the full knowledge of the facts, one might assume that it was a little careless of the future king to leave her side. But if the general supposition was that she's weak, getting weaker, very frail, but she still might have a few days, one can understand why he couldn't keep constant vigil, especially as she had her beloved daughter at her side, as well as other attendants. Sir Edward, the late Queen's private secretary, prepared a statement. This was normally against policy to offer any sort of commentary over matters of health regarding the Queen, but the rumour mill was beginning to churn and would certainly go into overdrive without anything at all. And it is also made known that the Queen and the late Duke did not enjoy the attention of well-wishers flocking to their bedsides whenever they were ill. So, it's not the family way, and is thought of as a little bit suffocating. So the statement that was put out was rather enigmatic in tone, allowing the public to read between the lines, and I thought that it was very well done. I remember that moment as I'm sitting here. I remember it so crystal clear, don't you, my dear, when that first statement emerged. The bulletin was issued from Buckingham Palace at 12:32, and it was emailed to every major news organisation in the kingdom. The Queen's doctors are concerned for Her Majesty's health and have recommended she remain under medical supervision. The Queen remains comfortable and at Balmoral. Just 2 minutes before that statement was released, the Royal Air Force arranged for the south-based royal caravan of William, Andrew, Edward, and I think it was Sophie as well, wasn't it, to fly from Northolt to Aberdeen on a 2:30 flight. And by happenstance, as we know, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were in town for their jamboree and for the European leg of their worldwide privacy tour. How lucky. As Harry himself detailed in Spare, he received a call from Prince Charles, this is his version of events, a call warning him that the Queen's health had taken a turn. He says he texted William, and this boggles the mind because rather important matters are underway. He could have called him, couldn't he? He could have tried. Is he really so unfamiliar with that old-fashioned technology of the telephone call? Could have tried it. Doesn't mention it. It was text. Did he want to make sure everything was in writing for future notes? A little aide-memoire? Anyway, he texted William and asked if William and Catherine were flying up and when and how. No response, claims Prince Harry, which seems to confirm the fact that the Walesers have washed their hands of the Sussexes, William in particular. Meg and I looked at flight options, Harry tells us. Some reports say that Prince Harry had delayed Spare, had made the decision to delay it. Or should I say that the delay of Spare was caused by the fact that Harry wanted to wait for the Queen to die before he published it. Well, again, this consideration I must reject because I think it was impossible to say when the game would actually be up, and also January 2023, when it was eventually released fairly early on, was perfect timing. It was perfect timing for that book to make maximum impact. It was after Christmas, around this time of year actually, probably precisely, isn't it? Round about now. A year of Spare, my dear. But it's the perfect time. It's that lull. It's the bleak month. If you're in this hemisphere, everyone wants a little pick-up, People want to spend their Christmas money. It didn't get lost in the Christmas rush. It was the new sensation of the year, and it was dropped in just before the coronation festivities began. So I'm not quite so sure that he was doing it to spare the Queen's feelings. In fact, I totally reject that idea. It was a business decision. He didn't know when she was going to die, and it was a better date put forth by the publishers, no doubt. But regardless, we have to bear in mind that at this point, even though William and Catherine had both been disastrously betrayed, the book had yet to be released. So the salt was yet to be rubbed into that gaping wound. William did not know what the book was going to reveal, and Harry certainly wasn't going to brief him on it. So why should he pick up a call or respond to a text or give him any sort of time of day? But, having said that, we learn that an aide from Kensington Palace is adamant that no call was received by the Sussex camp. Now, I'm not talking about texts between individual phones, the phones of individuals. I'm talking from camp to camp, because this is the way that they would usually relate with each other. As in Kensington Palace courtiers having dialogue with members of the Sussex's staff. Apparently, there was no call received by their camp, and this palace aide tells us they had all the numbers. It seems that didn't suffice. Harry didn't think to do that. No call was made to them. Harry and Meghan cancelled all their engagements, and they were searching for flights. He probably tried to pull Concorde out of retirement. "This is Prince Harry. I could be king in a few hours' time. Bring Concorde out of retirement. I need to fly her. I need the quickest route to Balmoral and to my destiny." Ha! Ha ha ha! In your dreams, lover boy. In your dreams. And this is when Harry received that fabulous call from Prince Charles, telling him, "Yes, come, my darling boy, but don't bring Meghan." And he tried to do it more tactfully, but apparently he failed. Now let's make it very clear. That's the wicked daughter-in-law, but as for his beloved daughter-in-law, his beloved Catherine, who he would toss rose petals at her feet to spend an idle hour with her, that loving daughter, make no bones about it, she would have been extraordinarily welcome to come. Loved by all in the family. Never shown the merest hint of disrespect, the merest hint to any member of the royal family or anybody at all, ever. Immaculate, she would have been welcomed with open arms, but as it happened, due to luck rather than judgment, Catherine decided that she would be more useful away from all the drama. She didn't want to add to the drama, and with her children, because it was their first day or first week. It might have been the first day. Term was just beginning, and she had children to tend to, and they were about to find that possibly their great granny, old Gan, was gonna kick the bucket, and she wanted to be there with them, rather than rushing to the scene of drama for a cameo part. And isn't that something for us really to consider? That she would have had the opportunity to be involved physically in that moment in history of a 70-year reign coming to an end. Can you imagine some of the other members of the family volunteering to stay away for practical reasons, and because they didn't have the fragile ego, the narcissistic ego of those that want to rush towards tragedy and drama and shower the poor insufferables with cookies and honey and milk and sandwiches and bananas with words written on them, telling them how valuable they are. You're never going to get that from our future queen. And isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? It is. It was difficult for Charles. He didn't know if his words on the phone to Harry would remain private. And guess what? They didn't. So he had every cause to hedge around the bushes. Harry described Charles in Spare as nonsensical and disrespectful on this call. "I wasn't having any of it. Don't ever speak about my wife that way." Ha! Ha ha ha! You brat. Isn't it astonishing, my dears? It's astonishing. Charles is about to lose his beloved mother and face the moment that he has spent over 70 years, 73, 74 years waiting for and for preparing for. This is it. This is the day that he's thought about every day of his life, most likely. At that moment, he is faced with dealing with a spoiled brat, lecturing him. "Don't ever speak about my wife that way." He never wants to speak about your wife in any way. Trust me. Then Charles explained that he didn't want a full house and said that Catherine wasn't coming either. "Then that's all you needed to say, Pa." This is what Harry said. "Then that's all you needed to say." No, that's fine. So, it was about Catherine. As soon as he found out Catherine's not going, "Oh, well, that's all right then." Can you believe the pettiness, the pugnaciousness? It absolutely boggles the mind. All flights to Aberdeen were full and gone, so Harry chartered his own aircraft. I'm not so sure that he took his own advice about green travel, his travel list credentials, but that's what he decided to do. With small change of 30 or 40 grand, he scrambled up to Scotland. And the sources tell us that still at this point, everybody was thinking that the late Queen still had days to go rather than hours, and that there was no panic in that kind of sense. A lot of concern, absolutely, but not the panic. And this is why, along with the reasons that I outlined a few minutes ago, this is the reason why the Rodseys left the Queen's side after an hour. Anne was there, Angela was there, two angels, if you will, to watch over her, along with Reverend Mackenzie of Crathy Kirk, who was also the Queen's chaplain, and he read to her from the Bible. And because there was still no great panic, even at that very late moment, Sir Edward was sitting there mulling whether or not to pop over to Craigellachie Lodge to munch on a sandwich and have a spot of lunch. There was still no requirement for constant medical supervision. But Dr. Glass decided to err on the side of caution, and he based himself at the small surgery that is attached to the castle rather than return to his surgery 8 miles away in Ballater. And just a dot after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dr. Glass received an urgent call to go to the Queen's bedside. Princess Anne called Birk Hall and summoned Charles. On the grounds of Birk Hall, Charles was spending his very final moments as the Prince of Wales in the throes of the most perfect activity possible that you could associate with dear Charles. He was foraging mushrooms. I absolutely love it. He often does this to collect his thoughts, and that's exactly what he was doing, out in nature, just as the man we know and care for. The late Queen was up a tree in Kenya at the moment of fate. But Charles was fumbling around fungi with those warm sausagey fingers of his in Scotland as the minute drew near. Camilla, the Duchess of Rothesay, was taking a walk, and it appears that if not at the actual moment when he was foraging mushrooms, I wish it was, that would have been fabulous, but if not at that precise moment, it was when he was en route to the castle when Charles became king. Because they leapt into that Land Rover that they had borrowed with their team and Charles took the wheel, and by the time Dr. Glass reached the Queen's chamber, she appeared to have stopped breathing. He emerged and was greeted by Sir Edward, and he confirmed to Sir Edward that Queen Elizabeth II was dead. And I will confess to you, my dear, that when I wrote these notes a few hours earlier, tears sprang to my eyes when I wrote that. Yes, that's what he confirmed. He had the grave duty. He had that grave duty, my dears. Queen Elizabeth II, after that long reign, was dead. What a privilege for Dr. Glass, eh, my dears? Dr. Glass agreed the time of death with Sir Edward, and Sir Edward recorded the sequence of events in an internal memo to record the activity for posterity. And astonishingly, Robert Hardman is revealing what Sir Edward wrote in his memo. I can only assume that it's accurate, because it would take someone with a great amount of gumption and gall and a bit of stupidity to publish the contents of that memo in a book were they not true. But he tells us that this memo read, Dougie Glass in at 3:25, very peaceful, in her sleep, slipped away, old age. Death has to be registered in Scotland. Agree 3:10 p.m. She wouldn't have been aware of anything. No pain. So there we have it, apparently from the words of the late Queen's most senior courtier, loyal and trusted confidant. Agreed 3:10 as the time of death. Sir Edward was under pressure to inform the new king at once and before anyone else. Now, if you know Scotland and that kind of area and all around Aberdeen, sure, bad signals can be prone to bad signals with mobile phones. So there was a bit of to and fro, but eventually the phone vibrated in the pocket of Clive Alderton, who was travelling in convoy with the Rothschiilds, and he asked Charles to pull over and stop. And he handed Charles the phone, and as he did so, Charles knew they'd just turned off the B967 roadway onto the back drive of the Balmoral estate, and at 73 years old, he was addressed as Your Majesty for the very first time when he took that phone call. And he simply replied and said in a soft voice, We're nearly there. Again, Princess Anne greeted them at the grand entrance. She does that so much, doesn't she? She could get a job as a beefeater at the Tower of London. Well, she greeted them, and we are told that she had been visibly distressed, as is perfectly natural and normal, and as you can imagine, and we are told that a senior staffer had offered her a hug, which she received with grace, but then kind of said, okay, that's the last time I'll be doing that. Sir Edward, meanwhile, had rushed through the castle to the grand entrance because he, as the late Queen's private secretary, had been preparing with excruciating detail for the time-honoured constitutional ritual of this moment, and he wanted to greet the new sovereign in the formal manner as the Queen's most senior courtier. But His New Majesty, King Charles, greeted Sir Edward and put an arm on his shoulder, and he said, I know how much you'll miss her and how loyal to her you were. Then Sir Edward was duty-bound to ask the new king a few formal questions, including, under which name will you reign? Because Charles had the option of 4 of his names to become his regnal name. He went for Charles. He was asked for permission to call the new Prime Minister, and the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, had been kept updated throughout the day, and she had just retreated to her flat at number 10, Downing Street when she was informed via Simon Case. Charles and Camilla spent time at the late Queen's bedside before then breaking the news to their famille en route, if you will, to everybody from the family that was on way. And a strict process was followed. It was Charles's duty to inform the heir as next of kin, and he had to do it via switchboard from Balmoral. And we are told from one member of staff who recalls the moment when they or their colleague spoke to the new king, not knowing that the late Queen had died, and recalls that Charles was very hesitant because he said, "Hello, it's..." and he couldn't call himself the Prince of Wales. It wouldn't really do to just say, "It's Charles," and he couldn't say, "It is the King," because the information would have leaked and everybody would have known, and it would have lit a torch and spread like wildfire. And William must know next. So he couldn't say that, so he apparently said, "Hello, it's me." He took a chance and he described himself as me, which would have been out of character, but luckily his voice was recognised. The switchboard operator got it and put through the call. So that's how that was dealt with. And he informed William as he was driving along with the Duke of York and the Earl of Wessex, and I'm sure I remember Sophie being in that car as well. I think she was with them, wasn't she? Anyway, that lot. Lady Chatto arrived, beloved niece of the late Queen, and she arrived in tears. Poor dear. We do love Our Lady Sarah, don't we? That gorgeous, delicious gâteau known as Lady Sarah Chatto. Delicate flower. Harry was in the clouds. Well, he's always in the clouds, but this time it was literally. So he was not contactable. And in his recollection, now this is very interesting, his recollection of proceedings is that nobody bothered to inform him, and he was reduced to learning the news via the BBC as he was landing. Didn't he say that Meghan sent some link to him? Goes in one ear and out the other, but apparently nobody bothered to tell me. I'm the most important one, but nobody bothered to tell me. Well, recollections may vary. Hey, Lilibet, recollections may vary because a palace source, a member of staff, has told Robert Hardman that the king had been urgently trying to make contact with Harry. And they say there were repeated attempts to get through to him, but no calls were going through because Harry was airborne. And perhaps he wasn't one to answer calls anyway, if he likes to do everything by text and can't actually dial a number and call someone. If he wants to communicate that way, maybe he didn't want to pick up the phone. The Archbishop of Canterbury, meanwhile, who is a rather nervy character at times, isn't he, my dears? Rather nervy. I can't quite get past the inelegant way that the crown was positioned, but I understand he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he said at that moment that I was rushing around the house. We guessed that the late Queen was very, very near the end of her life. My head was just spinning with the thought that this is the real thing. And then the phone went. It was the Chief of Staff. He just said, "London Bridge." Back at Balmoral, Sir Edward and Sir Clive were confronted by one of the footmen bearing the late Queen's red box. The last red box to have been presented to Her late Majesty before her death. Now, red boxes have two keys, one for the monarch and one for the duty private secretary. And these boxes brought her the most secret and sensitive state secrets for her entire reign. And this one contained her last completed homework. Inside, Sir Edward found a sealed letter to her heir, King Charles, and a private letter to him, Sir Edward. And we will likely never know the words contained therein, unless they end up on eBay someday, but it does appear that the late Elizabeth knew that her time was up and had sensed that it was the moment to write those final sentiments and seal them. Also inside the box was a long list of candidates to fill vacancies in the ranks of the Order of Merit, accompanied with notes so that the late Queen could approve a shortlist of her own. And that order, as you may know, is limited to just 24 people. It's taken very seriously because this honour, if you will, is in the gift of the monarch, not of the government, which is the usual way. So it's taken very seriously, and the late Queen had ticked her choices, which from memory include our dear Baroness Fleur Benjamin, for example, and I think 5 others. But that was actually the last document that she ever handled, and she did it from her deathbed. Thank you very much for spending a little Jackanory moment with me, my dears. I hope you enjoyed a cup of tea and a slice of cake and washed it down with a bit of river. Let's see what other insights and tidbits and revelations are thrown up when that book by Robert Harden is released next week. I'm rather curious to see. But for now, my dears, take care, stay fruity, and toodle pip.